My name is Megan Wells. I am 34 years old. 72 hours ago, I stood in a rented loft in downtown Seattle, surrounded by wealthy tech investors, and watched my brother-in-law raise a glass to his new startup. He was celebrating with $250,000 he stole directly from my home equity. He smirked at me from across the room. My husband stood right next to him, looking at the floor, choosing his brother over his marriage, just like he always did. They thought they had me trapped in a felony they orchestrated together. They assumed my love for my husband would act as a permanent shield for their crimes. What happened next made the lead investor walk out the door, made my mother-in-law drop her champagne, and made my husband finally realize why you never hand a forensic data analyst an interrupted window to audit your life. Before I share exactly how a forged signature dismantled my marriage, please take a second to like and subscribe to Emily Told Stories, but only if you genuinely connect with this kind of truth. Drop a comment telling me your age and where you are listening from today. Now let me take you back to the phone call that initiated the collapse. It was a Tuesday morning. The Seattle rain was beating in heavy gray sheets against the glass windows of my downtown office. I held a lukewarm cup of black coffee scanning a pristine color-coded spreadsheet. My desk phone chimed. The caller ID displayed a generic toll-free routing number. I picked up the receiver. The voice on the other end was sterile, carrying the rehearsed tone of a corporate compliance officer. Is this Megan Wells, co-owner of the residential property on Mercer Island? I said it was. The woman paused. We're calling from Cascade First National to verify a $250,000 equity withdrawal initiated against your home yesterday afternoon. I did not drop my coffee. I did not gasp or demand an explanation. I am a forensic data analyst for a global tech firm. My entire career is built on identifying hidden anomalies in digital ledgers. I set the ceramic mug down on my desk. The sharp clink echoed in my quiet office. My mind instantly rendered a vivid image of our kitchen counter at home, a teetering, chaotic pile of my husband David's unopened mail and scattered receipts. A physical manifestation of his negligence. 3 days earlier, his brother Connor had smiled over a catered dinner and whispered that his startup funding problems were handled. David had stared at his plate, choosing silence. The missing variable slotted perfectly into the equation. Connor had committed a crime, and my husband had held the door wide open for him. Ms. Wells, the representative, prompted, "Are you there?" I pulled up our digital property deed on my secondary monitor, tracing the lines of our joint ownership. "I am here," I replied, keeping my voice in a flat, precise register. "I authorize nothing, and I suggest you lock down that account immediately." 6 months earlier, the blueprint of this betrayal was drafted over wild-caught salmon at my mother-in-law's condo in Bellevue. To understand how a forged signature becomes the inevitable conclusion of a toxic family dynamic, you have to understand the architecture of the people involved. I am 34 years old, and I live by absolute variables. In forensic data analysis, numbers do not lie, they do not guilt-trip, and they certainly do not ask for favors. Data provides a clear structural truth. My husband David is 36, a mid-level project manager whose entire existence has been molded around a singular, exhausting purpose. He acts as a human shock absorber for his younger brother. Whenever Connor creates a tremor, David throws his own body over the fault line to keep their mother from feeling the vibration. Connor is 32 and proudly refers to himself as a serial entrepreneur in Seattle's hyper-competitive tech scene. In reality, Connor is a parasite wrapped in a Patagonia fleece who burns through angel investments for applications that never make it to market. He speaks in venture capital jargon, using terms like disruptive synergy and decentralized paradigms to mask the fact that he has not held a paying job in a decade. That Tuesday evening in October, Patricia had summoned us to her high-rise for a celebratory dinner. Her condo was a testament to curated appearances. Cream-colored rugs, fragile glass tables, and expensive abstract art that she purchased not because she liked it, but because an interior designer told her it projected wealth. She served the meal on bone china, pouring a very rare Pinot Noir. It was the kind of carefully orchestrated evening designed specifically to soften a target. Midway through the main course, Connor cleared his throat and adjusted the cuffs of his tailored shirt. He reached into his leather messenger bag and slid a glossy, heavy-stock prospectus across the mahogany dining table. It landed right next to David's wine glass. Connor leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, projecting an unearned confidence. He announced he was launching a new blockchain-based logistics startup. According to him, it was guaranteed to revolutionize supply chain management across the Pacific Northwest. There was just one minor logistical hurdle. He was short on his seed funding round and needed a bridge loan to keep his developers working through the quarter. Connor looked directly at my husband. He asked for a quick lien on our house. Just $250,000, 6 months tops. He promised he would pay it back with interest the moment his Series A funding cleared. He asked for it as casually as one might ask someone to pass the salt. I did not look at David. I reached out and opened the glossy folder. I am accustomed to reviewing corporate financial disclosures, so scanning Connor's amateur spreadsheet took less than 30 seconds. The math was pure fiction. His projected customer acquisition costs were impossibly low. His burn rate was astronomical, heavily weighted toward executive salaries and offshore development teams with no clear deliverables. There was no viable revenue model. It was a financial sinkhole printed on premium paper. More importantly, the house he wanted to leverage was my sanctuary. It is a beautiful mid-century modern split level on Mercer Island. I saved for 5 years to pay the primary down payment. I spent weekends restoring the original hardwood floors and updating the fixtures. That house represented my independence, my hard work, and the safe harbor I thought David and I were building together. I had spent countless nights tracking mortgage rates on pivot tables, calculating equity curves, and saving a portion of every paycheck to secure that property. I was not going to risk the physical manifestation of my discipline for a fabricated tech venture designed by a man who had never held a real job. I closed the folder and pushed it back across the smooth mahogany surface. The heavy paper slid until it touched Connor's plate. "No," I said. My voice was clean level and devoid of any lingering hesitation. "We are not leveraging our home for a high-risk startup." The dining room plunged into an immediate, suffocating silence. The only sound was the distant hum of the city traffic drifting up through the rain-slicked windows. Patricia's silver fork clattered sharply against her fine china. She set her napkin down with precise, deliberate anger. She looked at me as if I had just spat on her pristine dining table. "Megan, it is family," she said, her tone dripping with weaponized maternal disappointment. "We invest in each other. Your generation is so focused on yourselves. Connor is on the verge of something extraordinary, and you are letting a few numbers get in the way of his future." I did not take the bait. I did not explain the flaws in his revenue model or point out that investing implied a potential return, which this project clearly lacked. Instead, I turned my gaze to my husband. This was the critical juncture. This was the moment the foundation of a marriage is tested. I waited for David to look up. I waited for him to slide the folder back to his brother and say that our home was off limits. I waited for him to defend the boundaries we had supposedly agreed upon when we merged our lives. David stared down at his half-empty wine glass. His shoulders hunched, shrinking inward as if trying to minimize his physical presence in the room. A faint flush crept up his neck, betraying his internal panic. He looked at his mother, then at his brother, and finally offered a weak, placating smile. "We will talk about it, Mom," David mumbled. He did not say no. He did not tell his brother that the request was inappropriate. He deferred. He offered a non-committal compromise to avoid the immediate discomfort of his mother's glaring disapproval. In that single mumbled sentence, David showed me exactly where his loyalties resided. A firewall is only as strong as its weakest access point. You can build the most robust security protocols in the world, but if someone on the inside leaves a side door unlatched, the entire system is vulnerable. I sat back in my chair and took a slow sip of my water. The taste of the expensive salmon turned to ash in my mouth. Connor picked up his wine glass and offered me a fleeting, triumphant smirk. He knew he did not need to convince me. He only needed to apply pressure to the weakest structural beam in the room. The dinner continued in a strained, fragile peace. Patricia steered the conversation toward her upcoming charity gala, ignoring me entirely. She served a decadent chocolate dessert, sweetening the atmosphere after the bitter tension. Connor talked loudly about his networking meetings in Silicon Valley, spinning tales of venture capitalists who were supposedly clamoring to fund his vision. David nodded along, pouring more wine, laughing a little too hard at his brother's jokes, desperately trying to smooth over the fracture in the room. I spent the rest of the evening observing them like subjects in a clinical trial. I watched how seamlessly Patricia elevated Connor's delusions into grand ambitions. I noticed how she treated David not as a son to be proud of, but as an instrument to facilitate Connor's success. And I saw how David willingly accepted that role, sacrificing his own dignity to keep the family narrative intact. When we finally drove home that night across the floating bridge toward Mercer Island, the silence inside the car was thick and heavy. The smell of damp wool and the faint trace of Patricia's floral perfume clung to our coats. The rain lashed against the windshield, the wipers fighting a losing battle against the downpour. The rhythmic thud of the tires on the wet asphalt felt like a metronome, counting down the seconds of our marriage. David kept his hands firmly on the steering wheel, his eyes fixed straight ahead on the glowing red taillights of the traffic. "You did not have to be so blunt with him," David finally said, his voice defensive. "He is just exploring his options." "He wants to put $250,000 lien on our house, David," I replied, staring out at the dark water. Blunt is the only appropriate response. "I said we would talk about it," he countered. "That means no." "That means you left the door open," I corrected him. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. "You do not understand how they operate, Meg. If I shut him down in front of my mother, she will not speak to me for a month. It is easier to just let him pitch his ideas and let it fade out." I leaned my head against the cold glass of the passenger window, watching the headlights blur in the rain. I realized then that my husband operated on a policy of appeasement. He thought that by refusing to draw a hard line, he was keeping the peace. He did not understand that appeasement is merely a delayed surrender. I thought our financial and emotional boundaries were solid, reinforced by legal deeds and joint checking accounts. But that night, I recognized the fatal flaw in the architecture of my marriage. David would never protect me if it meant disappointing Patricia or Connor. He had handed them the blueprint to our vulnerabilities. That deferred mumble at the dinner table was the open back door they needed. I just did not yet know how quickly they were going to walk right through it. Fast forward to a bitterly cold Tuesday evening, exactly 3 weeks before the Fraud Prevention Department called my office. The Seattle winter had settled in early, bringing with it a biting wind that whipped straight off the Puget Sound. I had just returned from a long day analyzing structural anomalies in our corporate cloud architecture, and I was exhausted. The sky was a bruised purple, and the driveway was slick with freezing rain. I was standing beside David's SUV, a sprawling, expensive vehicle he insisted on leasing despite our perfectly adequate sedans. I was searching for an umbrella, having left mine at the office. I opened the passenger door and leaned over the center console. The interior of his car was a chaotic reflection of his mind. Discarded gym bags, fast food wrappers from lunches he claimed he never ate, and empty coffee cups littered the floorboards. As I reached beneath the passenger seat, feeling for the familiar handle of the umbrella, my fingers brushed against something stiff. It was thick, heavy stock paper. I pulled it out. It was a manila folder, crisp and remarkably out of place amidst the accumulated debris of my husband's daily life. My name, Megan Wells, was printed neatly on the protruding tab. I stood there in the freezing rain, the open car door shielding me from the worst of the wind, and opened the folder. The dome light illuminated the dense legal text on the first page. It was a finalized contract for a $250,000 home equity line of credit. The collateral listed was our Mercer Island property. I felt a sudden sharp drop in my internal temperature, an immediate visceral reaction to unauthorized data modification. I flipped past the amortization schedules and the legal boilerplate directly to the signature page. There, in sharp, aggressive blue ink, was my name. The signature was an impressive attempt at mimicking my handwriting, but to a trained analyst, the deviations were glaring. The loops were too tight, the pressure applied by the pen too heavy, the baseline slightly erratic. It lacked the fluid, automatic muscle memory of my actual signature. It was an arrogant, sloppy forgery. Directly adjacent to the forgery was David's signature. It was authentic, verified, perfectly matching the thousands of times I had seen him sign birthday cards and tax returns. He had co-signed a fraudulent loan, leveraging the home I paid for, bypassing my consent entirely. My eyes moved down the page, stopping abruptly at the bottom right corner. A raised, circular seal marked the document as officially notarized. The stamp bore the name of a notary public commissioned in Pierce County. This was the variable that made the equation impossible. Washington state law strictly mandates physical presence and valid government-issued identification to execute a remote or in-person notarization of real estate documents. Someone could not simply forge a signature. They needed an accomplice with a state-issued stamp to validate the theft. How had Connor and David bypassed a legal security measure designed specifically to prevent this exact scenario? I ran my hand back under the passenger seat, searching for anything else that might have slipped from the folder. My fingers closed around a small, crumpled piece of thermal paper. I smoothed it out under the dome light. It was a toll receipt for the Tacoma Narrows Bridge, dated the previous afternoon. The timestamp was 2:14 in the afternoon. Tacoma is 50 miles south of Seattle, located in Pierce County, the exact county listed on the notary stamp. The pieces snapped together with terrifying precision. David had not merely turned a blind eye to his brother's financial desperation. He had actively driven Connor across county lines to a complicit notary bypassing state law to finalize the theft of my equity. He was not a passive bystander. He was a willing accessory to a felony. My chest went incredibly tight. The instinctual human response would have been to march into the house, throw the folder onto the kitchen counter, and demand an explanation. The urge to confront him, to scream at the betrayal, was a physical pressure building in my throat. But I am a forensic data analyst. I have spent my entire adult life learning to suppress emotional reactions in favor of structural strategy. When you discover a malicious breach in a secure network, you do not immediately sever the connection. If you panic and cut the power, the intruder knows they have been detected. They will scramble their tracks, delete the audit logs, and deploy countermeasures. You observe. You document. You trace the malware back to its source until you understand the complete scope of the compromise. Only then do you execute a protocol to permanently neutralize the threat. I pulled my phone from my coat pocket and activated the high-resolution scanner application. Standing in the freezing rain, I photographed every single page of the forged document. I captured the amortization schedules, the forged signature, the notary stamp, and finally, the crumpled toll receipt. I verified the image clarity, backed the files up to a secure encrypted cloud server, and logged out. I carefully folded the toll receipt, placing it back beneath the passenger seat exactly where I had found it. I closed the manila folder and shoved it deep into the chaotic piles of gym bags, recreating the messy concealment David had arranged. I closed the car door, locked the vehicle, and walked up the front steps of my house. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the warm, brightly lit hallway. I could smell garlic and roasting vegetables. David was in the kitchen wearing a casual sweater, humming along to a podcast while he chopped onions. He looked up and smiled a warm, familiar expression that now felt like a carefully constructed mask. "Hey, you are home late," he said casually, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "I started dinner. Did you find your umbrella?" "No," I replied, my voice completely level, betraying nothing. "I must have left it at the office." He offered a sympathetic grimace. "Well, get out of those wet clothes. Dinner will be ready in 20 minutes. I walked upstairs to our master bathroom and stood under the hot shower until the freezing chill left my bones. I washed my hair, observing the steam rise and dissipate against the glass enclosure. I compartmentalized the betrayal, locking the raw emotion into a secure psychological vault. Over dinner, David talked animatedly about a new project management software his team was integrating. He complained about his boss and praised the roasted vegetables. I matched his cadence, nodding at the appropriate intervals, offering standard responses, while my mind calculated the geometry of my retaliation. He believed he had successfully navigated the crisis. He thought the money was secured, his brother was saved, and our marriage remained perfectly intact. He believed the secret was safely hidden beneath a pile of dirty gym clothes in his car. He did not realize that I had just downloaded the entire blueprint of his betrayal. I did not know yet where the money had gone or the full extent of Patricia's involvement, but I knew the foundational truth. My husband was a liability, and I was going to liquidate him. I just needed to gather the rest of the data before I triggered the collapse. I waited until Sunday morning to test the structural integrity of my marriage. Patience is a fundamental requirement in my profession. When you uncover a critical system vulnerability, you do not rush to patch it immediately. You observe how the system operates under stress. I needed to see exactly how David would react when presented with physical evidence of his own treason. The house was quiet, insulated from the outside world by thick windows and heavy walls. A steady, rhythmic rain drummed against the vaulted skylights in our master bedroom. It was a classic Washington morning gray, muted and chilling. The kind of morning that makes a home feel like a fortress. But the threat was already inside the perimeter. David was standing by the tall mirror attached to his cherry wood dresser. He was casually adjusting a pale blue silk tie, preparing for a morning golf outing at his country club with Connor. They played 18 holes every Sunday, regardless of the weather. He sprayed a precise mist of expensive cologne, a scent blending cedar and citrus. He looked relaxed, entirely at ease. He was humming a low tune under his breath. Watching him, I felt a profound sense of detachment. I was looking at a man I had shared a bed with for 5 years, but his features seemed entirely foreign. I recognized the shape of his jaw and the specific way he ran his fingers through his hair, but the person inhabiting that familiar frame was a stranger. A stranger who had mortgaged my future to fund a delusion. I held a thin stack of standard printer paper in my right hand. I had spent the previous night carefully enhancing the photographs I took in the freezing driveway, ensuring every forged loop and stolen notary stamp was rendered in high definition. I walked across the plush carpet, my footsteps silent. I stopped right behind him. His reflection caught my movement in the mirror. He offered a quick, reflex smile. "Good morning," he said, reaching for his silver watch on the dresser. "I did not want to wake you. Connor secured a prime tea time." I did not return the smile. I extended my arm and placed the printed photographs face up on the polished wood surface directly beside his watch. The crisp white paper contrasted sharply with the dark grain of the dresser. "When were you going to tell me you and your brother committed mortgage fraud?" I asked. I did not raise my voice. I did not inject any tremor or grief into the sentence. I used the exact level, clinical cadence I deploy in boardrooms when presenting a fatal flaw in a projected budget. David froze. The silver watch slipped from his fingers and landed on the wood with a dull clink. His eyes darted from the papers to my reflection in the mirror, then toward the bedroom door, searching for a physical escape route from a digital reality. The silence stretched thin and fragile. I watched the biological markers of panic flood his system. The relaxed posture evaporated. His shoulders hiked upward. A creeping red flush began at the base of his collar and spread rapidly up his neck. "It is not fraud, Meg," he stammered. His voice was an octave higher than usual, scraped thin by sudden fear. He turned around to face me, putting his back to the mirror, blocking the documents from his own line of sight, as if ignoring them would make them disappear. "Connor just needed the cash temporarily," he said, speaking too fast, running his words together. "He signed your name because you were at that data summit in Portland. We were on a strict deadline for the seed round. I was going to tell you, I swear, I was going to tell you, tonight." I stared at him, letting the pathetic weight of his excuse hang in the air between us. He did not apologize. He did not fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness. He justified the crime. He attempted to spin identity theft into a minor scheduling conflict. "He forged my signature, David," I replied, enunciating every single syllable to ensure there was no room for misinterpretation. "And you provided the authentic signature right next to it. You drove him to Pierce County, to a complicit notary to steal $250,000 from the equity I built. That is a federal felony." David shook his head, waving his hands in a frantic, dismissive gesture. "You are being dramatic. You always look at things through this rigid clinical lens. It is a family bridge loan. The logistics application launches next month. He has a meeting with a major venture firm on Tuesday. He will pay the entire balance off before the first statement even hits the mail." I listened to the desperate rationalization spilling from his mouth, and the final, lingering fraction of my respect for this man vanished. He was operating under a spectacular delusion. He truly believed that Connor's Phantom Software Company was going to generate real revenue. He had bypassed my consent, violated my trust, and risked our home because it was easier than telling his brother no. He chose the path of least resistance. He chose his brother. This was the moment the emotional tether snapped. In my line of work, a compromised asset is a liability. When a server is infected, you do not negotiate with the malware. You do not hope the virus decides to heal itself. You isolate the hardware, you extract the vital data, and you wipe the system clean. My husband had officially transformed from a partner into a financial and legal risk. I needed to liquidate him from my ledger. David misinterpreted my silence. He mistook my analytical observation for submission. He reached out and placed his hands on my shoulders, attempting a reassuring squeeze. His palms felt cold and damp. "Look, Meg, I know I should have called you," he murmured, trying to lower his pitch, aiming for soothing and landing on patronizing. "But everything is fine. You do not need to worry. Connor has this under control. Let me just go play this round of golf, and when I get back, we can sit down and look at his projection models together. You will see. It is a solid investment." I stepped backward, smoothly disengaging from his grip. He let his hands fall to his sides, looking confused by the seamless rejection. "Go play your round of golf, David," I said. My tone remained a flat, unreadable surface. He exhaled a long breath of relief, the tension visibly leaving his frame. He thought he had navigated the crisis. He believed his hasty excuses had patched the fracture. He picked up his watch, strapped it to his wrist, grabbed his keys from the nightstand, and walked out the bedroom door. I listened to his footsteps jog down the stairs, followed by the heavy thud of the front door closing. The sound of his engine starting echoed in the wet driveway, fading as he drove away toward the country club. I stood alone in the quiet master bedroom, listening to the relentless drumming of the Washington rain hitting the glass above me. David believed the confrontation was over. He believed the secret would remain confined to the four walls of our house, smoothed over by time and false promises. He was severely underestimating the protocol of a forensic analyst. I turned away from the mirror. I did not waste time shedding tears over a man who had already chosen his allegiance. I walked over to the dresser and picked up the printed photographs of the forged documents. David was merely the enabler, the open door that allowed the theft to occur. The architect of the crime was currently sitting at a coffee shop, waiting for his tea time. I did not need to yell at my husband anymore. I needed to drive directly to South Lake Union and look the real thief in the eye. I needed to hear Connor admit to the forgery out loud, and I knew exactly how to make him do it. I did not waste another second breathing the stale air of that house. The moment David's vehicle disappeared down the wet suburban street, I grabbed my trench coat and keys. South Lake Union is the beating commercial heart of Seattle's tech industry. It is a neighborhood constructed on a foundation of mirrored glass, polished steel, and endless streams of venture capital. The avenues are lined with sleek high-rises and expensive electric sedans. It is exactly the kind of curated environment where a man like Connor goes to pretend he belongs in the upper echelon of innovators. I navigated the slick, rain-washed avenues, feeling a glacial calm settling deep over my nervous system. I parked my car in a costly underground garage beneath an imposing office tower and walked out into the biting drizzle. I knew exactly where to find him. Connor treated a specific upscale espresso bar on Westlake Avenue as his personal executive boardroom. He frequently claimed the ambient noise of the roastery helped him brainstorm disruptive paradigms. In reality, he just liked being seen sitting among actual successful professionals. Pushing through the heavy brass doors, a wave of warm air carrying the rich, heavy scent of roasted espresso beans washed over me. The cafe was crowded with young software developers wearing corporate lanyards and executives dressed in tailored casual wear. I scanned the room, operating with clinical precision. He was sitting at a premium corner booth near the floor-to-ceiling windows. A long slab of reclaimed wood stretched out in front of him, serving as his stage. Connor looked like the poster child for unearned privilege. He wore a pristine gray quarter-zip fleece, a pair of wireless earbuds stark white against his ear, and a deeply satisfied expression. He was forcefully typing on a silver laptop, likely drafting another fictional pitch deck for an application that would never exist. Next to his keyboard sat an elaborately crafted artisanal latte in a heavy ceramic mug. That specific beverage cost nearly $8. He was sipping steamed milk, purchased with the stolen equity from my dining room floor. I walked toward him, my posture perfectly aligned, my footfalls silent against the polished concrete floor. I did not storm over. I moved with the calculated intent of a predator closing in on an entirely unaware target. When I reached his table, I stood, towering over his seated form for a full 3 seconds before he noticed the shift in lighting. He pulled one earbud out, frowning slightly as he looked up. His expression morphed from mild annoyance to mock surprise. "Well, look who decided to venture out of the suburbs," he drawled, leaning back against the leather upholstery. "Did David send you to check on my progress?" I did not offer a greeting. I reached into my coat pocket, withdrew the folded printed photograph of the signature page, and dropped it flat onto the reclaimed wood. I placed my index finger on the edge of the paper and slid it precisely across the table until it rested directly over his laptop trackpad. "Look closely, Connor," I instructed. My voice cut through the ambient chatter of the cafe, clean and razor sharp. "You have exactly 48 hours to reverse the wire transfer and cancel that fraudulent loan. The clock starts right now." I watched his eyes track downward to the document. I anticipated a flicker of panic. I expected his pupils to dilate or his breathing to hitch. Instead, the corners of his mouth twitched upward. He picked up the paper, examined the forged blue ink, and actually laughed. It was not a nervous chuckle. It was a full, resonant laugh of genuine amusement. He tossed the paper back onto the table as if it were a discarded napkin. "Relax, Megan," he said, picking up his ceramic mug. "You are acting like a television detective. The capital is already deployed. I wired it to my offshore development teams in Eastern Europe last night. You cannot reverse a completed international transaction. The money is gone, and it is currently paying for top-tier coders." I kept my gaze locked on his face, observing the sheer magnitude of his audacity. "You committed wire fraud and identity theft," I stated, laying the variables out plainly. "That is a federal offense." He took a slow, deliberate sip of his latte. "And what exactly are you going to do about it?" he challenged, setting the mug down with a soft thud. "Are you going to call the Seattle Police Department? Are you going to hand that paper to a detective and send your own husband to a federal penitentiary for conspiracy? Because David's authentic signature is sitting right there next to your fake one. He facilitated the whole thing. He drove the car to the office. If I go down, he goes down with me. You will lose the house anyway, trying to cover his exorbitant legal fees." He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. "You're boxed in, Meg. You lose, no matter which piece you move on the board." He thought he had executed a flawless checkmate. I shifted my focus to the bottom right corner of the printed photograph resting between us. I tapped the raised circular seal with my fingernail. "Tacoma," I noted, keeping my tone devoid of emotion. "A notary public commissioned in Pierce County requires physical identification. You bypassed a strict state mandate. Who owns the stamp, Connor?" His smirk widened, transforming into a display of pure, unadulterated arrogance. He could not resist bragging about his own perceived cleverness. He possessed the fatal flaw of all narcissists. He needed his victim to appreciate his genius. "Mom's old country club friend," he boasted. Her official license expired 3 years ago, but she kept the physical stamp in her desk drawer. We paid her $1,000 in cash to backdate a ledger entry and validate the paperwork. They will never trace it back to her. And even if they try, David will just swear you were in the room when it happened. It is a victimless crime. The application launches next month and everyone gets rich. You should be thanking me for taking the initiative. I absorbed the raw data, processing the implications in real time. He had just handed me every missing piece of the puzzle. Patricia was not just a cheerleader for his delusions. She was the direct logistical connection to the fraudulent notary. This was a multi-generational conspiracy, spanning from the matriarch down to the favorite son, with my husband acting as the disposable transport vehicle. Connor stared at me, waiting for the tears. He expected me to crumble to beg or to storm out in a fit of hysterical rage. He operated under the fundamental assumption that my affection for his brother was a permanent, immutable shield. He believed traditional family loyalty would blind me to the arithmetic of my own survival. He assumed I was a conventional wife who would protect her household at the cost of her own financial security. He did not realize that I had already emotionally divorced his brother 2 hours ago. He thought my silence was the sound of defeat. In reality, it was the sound of a structural engineer identifying the exact load-bearing pillar to demolish. I did not need to threaten him further. I had extracted the verbal confirmation required to proceed to the next phase of my protocol. I stood up, straightening the lapels of my coat. I left the printed photograph sitting on his keyboard, a tangible reminder of his confession. "Enjoy the latte, Connor," I said, turning away. I walked out of the espresso bar, leaving him bathed in his own unearned confidence. I had the confession. Now I just needed to prepare for the inevitable counterattack, because a parasite never goes quietly when you threaten its host. And judging by the sudden sharp vibration of my cell phone in my pocket, the matriarch of this toxic ecosystem was already mobilizing her defenses. By Tuesday morning, the family machinery was functioning at maximum capacity. When you challenge the primary narrative of a deeply enmeshed family, the response is rarely isolated. They do not operate as individuals. They deploy as a synchronized unit. Connor had undoubtedly relayed my ultimatum to the matriarch, and she mobilized her forces with the speed of a seasoned tactician. I arrived at the lobby of my downtown office building holding my security badge, prepared for a day of reviewing encrypted data packets. Instead, I was intercepted by Patricia. She stood near the polished marble security desk, looking entirely out of place amidst the rush of badge-swiping professionals. She wore a tailored beige trench coat, a silk scarf tied meticulously around her neck, and an expression of curated distress. As I approached, the heavy, cloying scent of her signature floral perfume cut through the sterile, filtered air of the lobby. It was a scent I associated with passive-aggressive comments, wrapped in polite smiles at Sunday dinners. Today, however, the polite smile was absent. She did not offer a greeting. She simply reached out, grasped my forearm with surprising strength, and pulled me away from the flow of foot traffic, steering me toward a quiet alcove near the main elevators. "David called me last night," she hissed, her voice pitched low, vibrating with tightly controlled anger. "He told me you are making an absurd fuss about Connor's loan. He said you cornered him at a coffee shop and threatened him." I looked down at the hand still gripping my forearm. She released it, smoothing the front of her coat as if dusting off a minor inconvenience. "A fuss," I repeated, maintaining an even tone despite the sudden spike in my heart rate. "Patricia, he committed identity theft. He forged my signature on a legal document and stole $250,000 from my home equity. That is not a minor disagreement. It is a federal crime." She waved her hand in a sharp, dismissive gesture, treating the word crime as if it were a mild exaggeration. "Oh, please, Megan, you are being incredibly dramatic," she retorted. "You always have to analyze everything until all the joy is sucked right out of it. Connor is on the absolute verge of a massive breakthrough. He has meetings lined up with top-tier investors. He just needed a temporary bridge. You have a 6-figure salary. You do not even need that money right now." I stared at her, letting the sheer magnitude of her entitlement settle over me. There it was. The unspoken foundational rule of the Wells family spoken aloud in a corporate lobby. My financial independence, my discipline, and my hard work existed for one singular purpose: to subsidize Connor's endless delusions. They viewed my income not as an achievement to be respected, but as an emergency reservoir they could tap whenever the favored son encountered a deficit. My house is not his venture capital fund. Patricia, I replied, my voice dropping to a glacial chill. And my signature is not a blank check. She stepped closer, invading my personal space. The scent of her perfume grew stifling. If you cause a scene and ruin his credit score right before he secures his Series A funding, you will destroy his future, she whispered, her eyes narrowing into cold, calculating slits. And for what? A technicality on a piece of paper? David authorized the transaction. It is family money. I felt a sudden, profound wave of exhaustion. It is a unique kind of fatigue that comes from arguing with someone who operates in an entirely different reality. She did not view the forgery as a violation. She viewed my reaction to it as an inconvenience. I am not ruining his credit, I stated clearly. I am protecting my own. And it is not a technicality. It is a fraudulent notary stamp secured by your friend in Tacoma. Patricia flinched. It was a microscopic movement, a slight tightening of the skin around her eyes, but it was there. She had not anticipated that I knew about her specific involvement in the logistics of the crime. Connor must have left that detail out of his frantic briefing. The realization that I possessed granular data regarding her complicity temporarily derailed her rehearsed script. She recovered quickly, shifting tactics from minimization to overt intimidation. If you go through with this, if you tear this family apart over paperwork, no one in our circle will ever look at you the same way. She warned, her tone shifting to a menacing purr. You think your little corporate title protects you? The people we know, the board's eyes sit on, they value loyalty. If you send your own brother-in-law to jail because you are too selfish to share your success, you will be a pariah. David will never forgive you, and I will make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of ruthless, unfeeling woman he married. She was threatening my social standing. She assumed my reputation among the Bellevue elite held the same weight as it did for her. She thought the prospect of hushed whispers at charity galas and turned backs at tennis clubs would force my compliance. She believed public pressure could override forensic evidence. I looked at this woman who had spent 5 years treating me with thinly veiled condescension. I looked at the mother who had enabled a criminal and sacrificed her other son to protect him. I felt no fear. I felt an overwhelming sense of clarity. I adjusted the strap of my laptop bag on my shoulder and offered her a small, perfectly calibrated smile. Let them look, I said. I turned my back on her and walked toward the bank of elevators. I did not look back to see her reaction. I swiped my security badge, listening to the satisfying beep that granted me access to a secure facility. The heavy steel doors slid shut, severing the connection, leaving her standing alone in the marble lobby. I knew Patricia would not simply absorb the defeat. She operated on a policy of total narrative control. If she could not intimidate me into silence, she would ensure the silence was forced upon me. She was going to deploy her network. She was going to strike preemptively, twisting the facts to cast herself and her sons as the victims of a greedy, vindictive wife. The elevator ascended smoothly, whisking me toward the 22nd floor. My mind was already categorizing the variables. Patricia had declared a social war, and I needed to prepare for the inevitable fallout. I understood the mechanics of a smear campaign, having analyzed corporate espionage tactics for years. The first strike is always designed to isolate the target, cutting off their support systems before they can mount a defense. I exited the elevator and walked down the quiet, carpeted hallway toward my office. I knew the rumors were likely already spreading, mutating with each phone call Patricia made from the lobby below. I was about to become the villain in a story they authored. But the critical error in their strategy was assuming I cared about the opinions of people who traded integrity for country club memberships. They were busy constructing a fragile glass house built entirely on gossip. I just needed to find a stone heavy enough to shatter it. Patricia did not wait. In the realm of narrative warfare, the first strike dictates the entire terms of the engagement. By Friday evening, the story circulating through our Seattle social network had been surgically rewritten. I attended an annual tech industry charity gala that weekend. It was an event I had supported for years, a gathering of venture capitalists, software engineers, and philanthropic board members held in a modernized historic venue near the waterfront. Usually, I walked into that room as a respected peer. Tonight, I walked into a localized quarantine zone. The rain lashed against the tall, arched windows of the venue, blurring the city lights into streaks of neon. Inside, the air hummed with the low frequency of curated networking. Waiters navigated the floor, carrying silver trays of champagne. I checked my trench coat and smoothed the lapels of my dark tailored suit. I expected tension, but I underestimated the sheer velocity of Patricia's social engineering. As I navigated the crowded ballroom, the whispers tracked my movements like a cold draft. Conversations abruptly halted as I approached, only to resume in hushed registers the moment I passed. It was a fascinating display of herd mechanics. Patricia had seeded the environment with a highly contagious virus, and I was the infected host everyone had been instructed to avoid. I approached the mahogany bar to order a sparkling water. Catherine, a prominent local venture capitalist who played weekly tennis matches with Patricia, was standing near the brass rail. We had shared pleasantries for years discussing market trends and local zoning regulations. As I stepped up beside her, she did not simply ignore me. She executed a deliberate physical pivot, turning her back so precisely that her silk evening gown brushed against my leg. She engaged the bartender in a sudden, intense conversation about citrus garnishes, acting as though the space I occupied was vacant. I received my drink and turned away unbothered by the theatrical snub. But the assault was multifaceted. Elise, an acquaintance who served on several local philanthropic committees, intercepted me near a tall floral arrangement. She held a crystal flute and wore an expression of practiced, synthetic sympathy. She reached out and lightly touched my arm, a gesture designed to look comforting while delivering a localized strike. "Megan," she murmured, pitching her voice to ensure the adjacent tables could hear her performance. "I was so sorry to hear about the friction at home. It must be so difficult carrying the burden of being the primary breadwinner. The stress makes some women so controlling. Just remember, a marriage is a partnership, not a dictatorship." I looked at Elise's carefully powdered face, processing the raw data embedded in her unsolicited advice. Patricia had engineered a flawless narrative inversion. She had taken my refusal to fund a fraudulent startup and weaponized it. The story Patricia planted was clear. I was not a victim of forgery. I was a financially abusive spouse sabotaging Connor's brilliant logistics application out of pure jealousy. I was cast as the greedy, domineering wife, holding David hostage with my paycheck. I did not pull my arm away. I offered Elise a calm, measured smile, holding eye contact just long enough to make her shift her weight uncomfortably. "I appreciate your concern, Elise," I replied, keeping my tone smooth and pleasant. "But I prefer to base my partnerships on verifiable data rather than country club fiction. Enjoy the champagne. The social isolation was an expected variable. The professional bleed, however, was a severe escalation. 20 minutes later, I was approached by Victor, a vice president of operations for a major cloud storage firm. We had been negotiating a lucrative independent consulting contract for 3 weeks. He intercepted me near the silent auction tables, looking distinctly uneasy. He skipped the standard networking pleasantries and addressed the issue directly. "Megan, we are reviewing the final terms of the contract," Victor said, keeping his voice low. "But I received a concerning phone call this morning. Someone suggested your current household instability might impact your risk tolerance and your ability to manage our data migration. We need a consultant who is focused, not distracted by internal financial disputes." The sheer audacity of the maneuver impressed me. Patricia was not just trying to embarrass me. She was actively attempting to sever my income streams. She wanted to prove her power by cutting off mine. I felt a cold spike of adrenaline, but I suppressed it instantly. I looked Victor squarely in the eye, projecting unwavering competence. "Victor, my risk tolerance is precisely why your firm is hiring me," I stated. "I identify vulnerabilities, and I eliminate them before they compromise the system. My focus is singular, and my external audits are airtight. If you base corporate contracts on suburban gossip rather than my documented track record of zero data breaches, your firm has a much larger vulnerability than a simple migration issue." Victor studied my face for a long moment, processing the logic. He nodded slowly, the unease dissipating, replaced by professional respect. "Fair point, Megan," he said, extending his hand. "I will send the finalized paperwork on Monday." I walked away from the auction tables, retreating to a quiet, shadowed balcony overlooking the main floor. I stood alone, watching the coordinated movements of the Seattle elite below me. I observed the way people leaned in to whisper behind manicured hands. I mapped the flow of the rumor mill, tracing the origin point back to Patricia. The standard human response to a coordinated smear campaign is desperate, chaotic reaction. The instinct is to scream the truth, to flood the family group chat with photographic evidence, to corner people at the bar and demand they look at the forged signature. When a group of people collectively decides you are a villain, the psychological pressure to defend your character is overwhelming. You want to interrupt their lies. You want to prove you are the rational one. But frantic texts and public outbursts only validate the narrative of the unstable, controlling wife. If I reacted with emotion, I would hand Patricia the exact visual confirmation she needed to secure her story. In cybersecurity, when a hostile entity launches a distributed denial of service attack, flooding your network with junk data, you do not waste resources fighting every single false request. You divert the traffic, lock down the core assets, and prepare a lethal countermeasure. I watched Catherine laugh at a joke near the bar. I watched Elise sip her drink, feeling righteous in her synthetic pity. They were busy constructing an elaborate, fragile stage where I was the antagonist. I decided to let them build it. If you are ever trapped in a targeted reputation attack, remember this core principle. Never interrupt your enemy when they are building a glass house. Let them raise the walls high. Let them admire their own reflection in the panes. Just focus all your energy on finding the heaviest stone. I knew what I had to do next. I needed uninterrupted time to complete my forensic audit and sever my financial ties. To get that time, I had to give Patricia, David, and Connor exactly what they wanted. I had to make them believe they had broken me. In forensic data security, when a critical breach is detected, the most dangerous action you can take is an immediate, hostile shutdown. If you trigger the alarms and sever the connections, the hostile actors realize they have been identified. They will scramble their tracks, erase the vital audit logs, and deploy counter protocols to hide their origin point. When you need to migrate sensitive assets out of a compromised environment, you must ensure the intruders feel entirely unobserved. You deploy a diversionary tactic. You create a false positive in a low-priority sector of the network, drawing the attention of the threat away from the core servers. I needed uninterrupted time to execute a complex financial extraction. I could not have David hovering near my screens, looking over my shoulder. Nor could I afford Patricia making frantic calls to her banking contacts to preemptively freeze our shared accounts. I needed them to stand down. The morning after the charity gala, the Seattle sky was a flat, bruised gray. I sat at my kitchen island with a single ceramic cup of black tea, watching the rain streak the large glass panes overlooking the deck. The house was quiet. I picked up my smartphone and opened the family group chat. The thread contained David, Connor, Patricia, and myself. The last message in that specific chain was from 3 weeks prior, an unremarkable photograph of a new dining room chandelier Patricia had purchased. I placed my thumbs over the digital keyboard and crafted a precise, calculated concession. Fine. You win. I do not want to tear this family apart over this. We will discuss a structured repayment plan on Friday night. Until then, I need some space. I read the sentences twice, ensuring the tone was appropriately defeated. I hit send. The response time was a remarkable testament to their collective underlying anxiety. Less than 2 minutes later, my screen illuminated with an incoming notification. Patricia replied with a single red heart emoji. It was a digital kiss of death from a woman who had spent the previous 48 hours orchestrating a campaign to ruin my professional reputation. Seconds later, a text bubble from Connor materialized on the screen. Knew you would see reason, Meg. He could not resist the patronizing jab. He possessed the fundamental weakness of all arrogant thieves. He needed the final word, the verbal confirmation of his own superiority. He truly believed his charm and his mother's social leverage had forced a seasoned data analyst into submission. That evening, David arrived home from his office earlier than usual. I heard the garage door rumble along its tracks, followed by the heavy thud of the interior mudroom door closing. He walked into the kitchen carrying a bouquet of expensive white lilies wrapped in brown butcher paper. His shoulders, which had been hiked up toward his ears with tension for weeks, were finally lowered. The tight lines of strain around his jaw had evaporated. He walked with the light, buoyant step of a man who had just dodged a catastrophic collision. "Hey," he said, offering a soft, relieved smile. He held out the floral arrangement. "I picked these up from the market near my building. I just wanted to say thank you. For understanding. I know Connor crossed a boundary, but a repayment plan is the right move. It keeps everything manageable. We will hold him accountable together." I looked at the bouquet. White lilies are traditionally associated with funerals. It was a fitting, if entirely accidental, tribute to the terminal state of our marriage. I took the damp paper wrapping from his outstretched hands. The floral scent was thick and cloying, reminding me instantly of Patricia's perfume in the lobby of my building. "Put them in water," I said, handing the flowers back to him. "I am going to read upstairs." I did not raise my voice. I did not glare or offer a cutting remark. I provided a hollow, convincing performance of an exhausted, defeated spouse. Over the next 2 days, I watched those lilies slowly wilt in a tall crystal vase on the kitchen island. The water turned a murky, opaque yellow, and the petals curled inward at the edges, shedding heavy pollen onto the polished quartz countertops. David ignored the decay, too focused on his renewed sense of safety to notice the mess. He whistled low tunes while brewing his morning coffee. He left his work laptop open and unattended on the living room coffee table. He went to the gym. He watched sports highlights on the television. He went back to sleep each night, breathing easily. David had grown up learning that conflict avoidance was the highest form of love. When his father departed decades ago, Patricia trained her remaining sons to maintain a pristine exterior at all costs. David learned early on to bury systemic problems under polite pleasantries. The flowers were his ultimate pleasantry. He genuinely believed a $30 bouquet could erase a federal felony. He was a man who had successfully deferred responsibility for his entire adult life, and he felt secure returning to that familiar holding pattern. By feigning surrender, I had lulled the entire Wells family into a profound false sense of security. They believed they had successfully broken my resolve with country club gossip and emotional blackmail. They assumed the modern professional wife's ultimate fear was social ostracization and marital collapse. They thought I had weighed the cost of losing my standing among the Bellevue elite against $250,000 and chosen the standing. They went back to their routines complacent and victorious. They likely congratulated themselves on managing the difficult, rigid daughter-in-law. But their shared arrogance was their fatal vulnerability. They failed to realize they had just handed a highly trained forensic auditor an unmonitored 48-hour window to permanently dismantle their financial existence. While they slept comfortably in their beds, I was awake. While they celebrated their imagined victory, I retreated to my home office on the second floor. I locked the heavy oak door, sliding the deadbolt into place with a soft click. I powered up my dual monitors. The quiet hum of the high-speed processor was the only sound in the dark room. I needed to map the entire financial ecosystem of the Wells family. The fraudulent real estate loan was merely the surface anomaly. In data architecture, a single compromised node often indicates a much deeper systemic infection. I needed to ensure my own direct deposits were isolated from the shared network. I needed to review the joint checking accounts, the shared investment portfolios, and the high-yield savings accounts we had built for a hypothetical future. I was preparing to execute a financial divorce before a judge ever saw a legal petition. I knew the community property laws in Washington state inside and out. I knew the specific legal loopholes separating shared marital assets from funds derived from independent premarital savings. The clock was ticking. I had promised them a family meeting on Friday night. It was currently Wednesday evening. I had roughly 48 hours to complete a deep dive into Connor's shell company, track the wire transfers, and move my defensible equity out of the blast radius. If David walked into my office and saw the terminal windows cascading across my screens, the decoy would fail instantly. But he never came upstairs. He never knocked on the door. He was too busy enjoying the peace he thought he had purchased with my submission. As midnight approached, I poured a second cup of black coffee. I bypassed the standard consumer banking portals and accessed the raw transaction logs using a specialized scraping protocol I developed for corporate audits. I was looking for the exact destination of the stolen equity. Connor had claimed the capital went to offshore developers in Eastern Europe. But numbers lack the human capacity for deception. The encrypted data packets began to render on my left monitor. I watched the routing numbers decode in real time, forming a clear, verifiable trail. And what I found did not lead to software engineers in Estonia or cloud servers in India. The trail led somewhere much closer to home. It led to a destination that would shatter the final, lingering illusion of my marriage and reveal the true depth of the conspiracy. While my husband and his family celebrated their imagined victory, I went to work. The house was entirely silent, except for the low hum of the rain outside and the whir of my computer processor. It was 2 a.m. I sat in my locked home office, bathed in the stark blue glow of my dual monitors. I am not a detective who kicks down doors or interrogates suspects in dimly lit rooms. I am an auditor. My weapons are IP addresses, transaction timestamps, and corporate registry databases. I began by legally accessing the joint banking portals I shared with David. I pulled the disbursement records for the fraudulent home equity line of credit. The digital trail was right there, waiting to be illuminated. Connor had sat in that upscale coffee shop and looked me in the eye, claiming the capital was already deployed to offshore development teams in Eastern Europe. He lied with the practiced ease of a career grifter. I followed the routing numbers. The $250,000 had not traveled to software engineers in Estonia or cloud server farms in India. The money had been fractured split into specific calculated tranches almost immediately after the bank released the funds. The first tranche was significant. $80,000 was wired directly to a high-yield cryptocurrency exchange. I cross-referenced the account details with public ledger data. It was not an investment. It was a rescue operation. Connor had been heavily leveraged in volatile digital assets, and the market had turned against him. That $80,000 was deployed to cover a massive impending margin call, effectively saving him from immediate financial ruin. He had stolen my equity to pay off a digital gambling debt. The second tranche was equally revealing. $40,000 was routed to a major national credit card provider. It paid off a private platinum credit line, completely zeroing out a massive standing balance. The remaining $130,000 was sitting stagnant in a corporate checking account. I traced the routing number identifying the recipient entity. It was a Shell limited liability company registered in the state of Delaware. The company had a vague corporate name implying tech logistics, but the corporate footprint was entirely hollow. There was no functioning website, no listed employees, and no operational history. Connor was not building a revolutionary supply chain application. He was operating a familial Ponzi scheme using newly stolen funds to plug the holes created by his previous financial disasters. But tracing the money was only the first phase of a forensic audit. I needed to understand the structure of the entity holding the remaining capital. I accessed the Delaware State Corporate Registry database. Delaware is notoriously friendly to corporate privacy, allowing companies to mask their true ownership through registered agents. However, Connor was arrogant, not thorough. He had utilized a cheap online incorporation service and failed to utilize the advanced privacy tiers. I paid the required state fee to download the unredacted articles of incorporation for the Shell LLC. The PDF document rendered on my right monitor. I scanned down the page past the boilerplate legal language to the section detailing the managing members of the corporation. Connor's name was listed prominently as the primary managing director. But there was a second name, listed directly beneath his. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting off my glasses. A sudden, icy chill traveled down my spine, settling heavily in my chest. Patricia Wells was explicitly listed as a silent shadow partner, holding a 49% equity stake in the Shell company. The implications slammed into me, rewriting the entire narrative of the betrayal. Patricia was not just a blindly devoted mother enabling her favored son's delusions. She was a documented corporate partner. She was actively legally profiting from the fraud. I pulled up the routing information for the $40,000 credit card payoff and cross-referenced it with the LLC's corporate data. The pieces aligned with sickening clarity. The private platinum credit line that Connor had paid off using my stolen home equity belonged to Patricia. She had used the proceeds from a forged mortgage document to wipe out her own personal debt. She was funding her curated Bellevue lifestyle, her country club memberships, her tailored trench coats, and her expensive floral perfumes, with money stolen directly from my dining room table. This is why she had ambushed me in my office lobby. This is why she had orchestrated the ruthless smear campaign at the charity gala. She was not just protecting her son from my anger. She was protecting herself from federal conspiracy charges. If I exposed Connor, I exposed the LLC. And if I exposed the LLC, the bank would instantly trace the stolen funds directly to her personal credit accounts. The betrayal was no longer just a reckless act of desperation by a failing tech bro. It was a coordinated extraction. They had looked at my discipline, my savings, and my property, and viewed it as a communal family asset, ready to be harvested. And David, my husband, had acted as the willing transport mechanism, ferrying the thief to the notary to facilitate the extraction. I leaned back in my ergonomic chair, staring at the corporate registry document. I did not feel the urge to scream or cry. The raw emotion had been entirely eclipsed by the absolute necessity of structural demolition. The arithmetic of revenge is profoundly elegant because it requires no raised voices. It requires no dramatic confrontations in public restaurants or tearful ultimatums in living rooms. It only requires proof. And I now possessed the complete, unassailable digital map of their conspiracy. I compiled the evidence. I organized the IP addresses mapping the origin of every login. I exported the transaction timestamps detailing exactly when the funds were moved. I downloaded the Delaware corporate registry documents highlighting Patricia's status as a shadow partner. I packaged the entire unredacted truth into a highly secure encrypted PDF dossier. The trap was fully constructed. The snare was laid out, waiting for the targets to step into it. But the data had one final layer left to yield. In my meticulous review of our shared financial architecture, I had focused entirely on the fraudulent loan. I had assumed the $250,000 was the extent of the damage. I was wrong. While confirming the isolation of my personal direct deposits, I initiated a routine scan of the high-yield savings account David and I had established 3 years ago. We had built that account specifically to fund our future, a secure reservoir intended for emergencies and potential children. I opened the account ledger expecting to see the familiar comforting balance. Instead, the number that rendered on the screen made my breath catch in my throat, forcing me to confront a betrayal that went much deeper than a forged signature. I thought I had reached the absolute foundation of the betrayal when I uncovered Patricia's name buried inside the corporate registry of that shell company. Discovering that a mother-in-law would orchestrate a sophisticated financial extraction against her own family was a profound shock, but it was a shock I could process. She was an external threat. I could categorize her actions as hostile interference and counter them using standard defensive protocols. My primary concern at 2 a.m. was securing my personal assets before confronting the external threats. I initiated a routine security sweep of our shared financial architecture. When mitigating a compromised network, you must ensure every single access point is evaluated. I needed to cross-reference all of our joint checking and savings portals to verify that my personal direct deposits were effectively isolated from the contaminated funds. The mechanical repetition of typing passwords and analyzing routing paths provided a temporary rhythmic comfort. It was the familiar, predictable structure of my daily profession, keeping the rising tide of panic at bay. The cursor hovered over a specific icon on my banking dashboard. It was a high-yield savings account David and I had opened 3 years ago, shortly after our second wedding anniversary. This specific ledger was not designed for vacations or home repairs or daily expenses. We had built this financial reservoir with a singular, sacred purpose. It was intended for our future children. Every other Friday for 36 months, we had deposited a strict percentage of our combined income into that account. We had spent countless Sunday mornings drinking coffee on our deck, discussing the specific life that money would eventually purchase. We debated the costs of converting the guest room into a nursery. We researched the tuition rates for the best early education programs on Mercer Island. We calculated the compound interest, projecting how secure our family would be by the time a child actually arrived. That account was not just a collection of numbers on a screen. It was a tangible, conceptual promise we made to each other about the future we were building together. I clicked the icon to verify the balance. The internal spreadsheet in my mind knew exactly what the number should be. Factoring in the recent quarterly interest yield, the account was supposed to hold $120,000. The page refreshed. The screen rendered the new data in stark black typography against a white background. The balance was $70,000. I did not move. I stopped breathing for a full 5 seconds. The glow of the dual monitors cast long, static shadows across the walls of my home office. A profound, icy sensation started at the base of my neck and traveled slowly down my spine, radiating a cold, finalizing pain outward into my ribs. This was not the sharp sting of Patricia's social sabotage or the arrogant irritation of Connor's coffee shop smirk. This was a deep, hollow structural collapse inside my own chest. $50,000 was gone. My fingers hovered over the keyboard, trembling slightly before I forced them into stillness. I clicked on the transaction history, pulling the most recent ledger activity. The withdrawal was not a slow bleed. It was a single, finalized wire transfer executed exactly 5 days ago. My mind instantly synchronized the timestamp with my own personal timeline. 5 days ago, I was standing on a shadowed balcony at a tech industry charity gala. I was watching venture capitalists turn their backs on me. I was listening to acquaintances offer synthetic pity while Patricia actively dismantled my professional reputation. While I was enduring a coordinated public execution in a crowded ballroom, my husband was sitting in the quiet safety of our home, liquidating the financial foundation of our unborn children. I focused my eyes on the memo line attached to the wire transfer. It contained 2 words typed in David's familiar, precise syntax: legal settlement. The data presented a glaring logical inconsistency. We were not involved in any litigation. There were no outstanding lawsuits, no property disputes, and no civil claims filed against our household. David had no reason to pay a legal settlement. I exported the routing number of the recipient institution and ran a trace through a secured financial database I utilize for corporate background checks. The wire transfer did not lead to a family lawyer or a local dispute mediator. The routing number belonged to a private wealth management firm managing the portfolio of a highly prominent Seattle-based angel investor. I recognized the investor's name immediately. He was a ruthless, independent venture capitalist who had funded one of Connor's earlier catastrophic software ventures 3 years prior. That specific venture had ended in a quiet, sudden bankruptcy, with all the initial capital mysteriously evaporating. Connor had always claimed the market simply shifted before the product could launch. I accessed a secondary legal database searching for sealed civil filings or pending arbitration notices linked to the investor and Connor's previous enterprise. The search query returned a hit. A draft complaint had been prepared but never officially filed. The investor was preparing to submit a formal comprehensive grievance to the Securities and Exchange Commission regarding Connor's previous fraudulent representations. The complaint detailed severe intentional misappropriation of investor funds. The puzzle pieces snapped together with a deafening finality, erasing any lingering doubt about my husband's character. Connor was on the verge of being exposed to federal regulators. A formal investigation by the SEC would have resulted in immediate criminal charges, asset seizures, and mandatory prison time. The investor was demanding restitution in exchange for his silence. Connor, the parasitic serial entrepreneur, did not have the capital to buy his own freedom, so David stepped in. David did not just forge a signature because he was afraid to say no to his mother. He did not just turn a blind eye to a minor indiscretion. David knew his brother was a practicing criminal. He knew Connor had defrauded investors, and he knew Connor was facing federal incarceration. Faced with the imminent destruction of his brother, David opened the digital vault containing the future security of his own family. He looked at the money we had painstakingly saved for our potential children. He looked at the nursery we had planned, the education we had promised, and the safety we had built. He weighed the value of his wife's trust and his unborn children's future against his brother's freedom. And he chose his brother. He drained our future to cover up the past. I sat in the silence of my locked office, staring at the transaction log until the numbers blurred into meaningless shapes. The last remaining tether of my marriage disintegrated. Up until this exact moment, a small, foolish fraction of my heart had tried to view David as a victim of his own toxic family dynamic. I had tried to see him as a weak man manipulated by a domineering mother and a sociopathic sibling. But this wire transfer was a premeditated, solitary act of betrayal. He was not a victim. He was a willing architect of my destruction. He had sacrificed my safety to maintain the illusion of his brother's success. The pain in my spine solidified into something dense and impenetrable. The grief shut off, replaced entirely by the cold, mechanical necessity of survival. I was no longer a betrayed wife crying over a fractured promise. I was a forensic auditor identifying a hostile threat inside a secure perimeter. The perimeter needed to be purged. I closed the transaction log and opened a new encrypted terminal window. It was time to sever the remaining connections. They believed they had chained me to their debt. They thought my income and my discipline would serve as a permanent buffer against their own reckless criminality. I needed to show them exactly what happens when the buffer decides to disconnect. I placed my hands on the keyboard, ready to execute a financial maneuver they would never see coming. I did not cry. Crying is a physiological response to sudden emotional overwhelm, a biological release valve for a nervous system unable to process an abrupt shift in reality. My nervous system was not overwhelmed. It was terrifyingly lucid. When you identify a terminal vulnerability inside a secure network, you do not mourn the corrupted code. You quarantine the server. Under the protective camouflage of my manufactured surrender, I initiated a comprehensive financial divorce long before any family court judge could ever review a legal petition. The state of Washington operates under strict community property guidelines. The standard judicial assumption is that all assets acquired during a marriage are divided equally, regardless of who generated the income. However, I am a forensic auditor. I built my entire career on understanding the microscopic exceptions buried deep within regulatory frameworks. I knew the precise legal loopholes regarding capital traced directly to independent inheritances and premarital assets. Before I ever walked down the aisle with David, I had accumulated significant personal wealth through rigorous savings and early tech industry investments. I had maintained an unbroken, pristine chain of documentation proving the origin of those specific funds. They were never commingled. They were legally defensible. I just needed to move them before the impending fallout froze the entire board. I shifted my attention to a dormant financial vehicle I had established 8 months prior. At the time, I set up a private wealth trust merely for tax optimization purposes, working with an independent fiduciary located across the water in Bellevue. The trust was structured as a separate legal entity impenetrable to standard civil claims or marital disputes, assuming the funds transferred into it were clean. 8 months ago, it was just a standard wealth management tool. Tonight, It became my fortress. I opened a secure encrypted browser window and accessed the portal for a separate banking institution where David had no credentials, no history, and no visibility. My fingers moved across the illuminated keyboard with the mechanical precision of a surgeon amputating a necrotic limb. There was no hesitation. First, I accessed my corporate human resources dashboard. I navigated to the payroll settings and deleted the routing numbers for our joint checking account. I input the routing parameters for my newly established private account. With a single sharp click of the trackpad, I redirected my entire six-figure salary. The financial pipeline that had sustained his comfortable lifestyle was instantly severed. Next, I targeted the credit architecture. David carried 2 credit cards tied directly to my primary Platinum account. He relied on them for his daily expenses, his exorbitant golf club fees, and his networking lunches. I navigated to the authorized user management console. I located his profile. I hit revoke. The digital confirmation flashed across the screen in stark green letters. Those premium pieces of plastic in his leather wallet were now entirely useless, deactivated rectangles. The final maneuver required flawless mathematical precision. I pulled the ledger for the remaining liquid assets we shared. I factored in the $50,000 he had stolen to pay off his brother's blackmail. I calculated the exact penalty, deducting his share of the remaining funds to cover the theft of my premarital contributions. I determined the precise dollar amount that legally belonged to my side of the ledger, down to the specific cent. I entered the transfer request. The banking interface prompted me with a secondary security verification. A 6-digit code materialized on my smartphone resting beside my keyboard. I typed the numbers into the prompt. Confirm transfer. The screen refreshed. A staggering sum of capital vanished from the joint network and materialized securely inside my private trust. I left exactly enough money in the shared accounts to cover the impending automated mortgage payment, preventing any immediate flags from our primary lender. Aside from that calculated remainder, the reservoir was bone dry. I sat back in my ergonomic chair and watched the dawn break over the Cascade Mountains. The sky transitioned from a bruised black to a pale, freezing gray. The rain had stopped, leaving the world outside my window looking washed out and exhausted. Inside my locked office, my financial ecosystem was now hermetically sealed. A few hours later, I heard the heavy footsteps of my husband ascending the stairs. He knocked lightly on the office door before turning the handle, finding the deadbolt engaged. "Hey, Meg!" he called out, his voice carrying a light, buoyant cadence. "I'm making coffee down here. Do you want a cup before I head into the office?" I unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway. I wore the same clothes I had worn the night before, but he did not notice. He was already turning away, walking back down the carpeted stairs. I followed him into the kitchen. He stood by the espresso machine, pouring steamed milk into 2 ceramic mugs. He looked rested. He looked like a man who believed the storm had passed. He slid a mug across the marble island toward me. "I was thinking," he said, taking a sip of his coffee. "After we sit down with Connor on Friday and hammer out that repayment schedule, maybe we should take a weekend trip. Drive down to the Oregon coast, get some fresh air. Just the 2 of us." I picked up the warm mug, letting the heat seep into my cold fingers. I looked at the man who had traded our future children for his brother's criminal freedom. He was standing in a house I paid for, drinking coffee purchased with my income, proposing a vacation he could no longer afford. "That sounds like a plan, David," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly neutral. He smiled, genuinely relieved. He reached over and squeezed my hand. "See, I told you everything was going to be fine. We just needed to communicate." He grabbed his briefcase from the hall table, kissed my cheek, and walked out the front door. I watched his SUV back out of the driveway and disappear down the suburban street. He was heading into the city, entirely oblivious to the reality that his financial spine had been surgically removed while he slept. By Thursday evening, the isolation was absolute. The perimeter was locked. David Connor and Patricia were now stranded on their own sinking ship, tethered only to each other. They had spent months treating my discipline as their personal safety net. They truly thought they had chained me to their catastrophic debt. They believed they had outsmarted the rigid analytical wife. They did not realize I held the key to the padlock. I had successfully extracted myself from the blast radius. Every single asset I cared about was secured behind a wall of impenetrable legal and digital encryption. I had spent 48 hours playing the role of the defeated spouse while actively pulling the financial rug out from underneath 3 generations of entitlement. The stage was perfectly set. The trap was fully constructed, and the bait was hovering right over the trigger. I went to sleep on Thursday night feeling a profound sense of tranquility. I knew what was coming the next morning, because on Friday at 9 a.m, the Fraud Prevention Department at Cascade First National was scheduled to conduct their routine verification of high-dollar equity withdrawals. And I was going to be sitting at my desk downtown, waiting for that exact phone call. Friday morning arrived with a relentless torrential downpour. I carried my single leather suitcase down the hardwood stairs, stepping softly to avoid the familiar creak near the landing. I left David snoring in the master bedroom, tangled in a mess of unwashed sheets. He looked entirely peaceful, wrapped in the false security of his own delusion. I locked the front door for the final time, feeling the cold metal of the deadbolt slide into place. Driving across the Interstate 90 floating bridge, the gray water of Lake Washington churned violently beneath my tires, mirroring the heavy slate sky overhead. I did not drive directly to my corporate tower. I had a mandatory tactical stop to make first. In the financial compliance sector, bank fraud investigators are essentially powerless without a sworn legal affidavit. They can flag anomalous transactions and monitor suspicious routing behavior, but they require external jurisdictional leverage to enact an immediate unilateral account freeze. I understood the regulatory framework. I knew exactly what mechanism was required to force the bank to act. I parked my car in the visitor lot of the Seattle Police Department East Precinct. The concrete building smelled of wet wool floor wax and stale coffee. I sat in a hard plastic chair across from an exhausted detective in a pale green cubicle. I did not offer tears or emotional embellishments. I handed him a physical, printed copy of my forensic dossier. I formally reported Connor for identity theft and wire fraud. I provided the expired Tacoma notary credentials outlining the deliberate circumvention of state identification laws. The detective reviewed the documents, his initial skepticism evaporating as he registered the sheer volume of organized proof. He typed the information into his terminal, generating a 10-digit case number. That specific sequence of digits was the ignition key for the entire demolition. I arrived at my office by 8:30. The city spread out below my window, blurred by the driving rain. I arranged my dual monitors, opening my secure email client and placing my cell phone precisely in the center of the glass desk. At exactly 9 o'clock, the device chimed. This brings us back to the very moment where our story began. The rehearsed, sterile voice of the Cascade First National Fraud Prevention Specialist filling the quiet space of my office. "Is this Megan Wells?" the woman asked. "We are calling to verify a $250,000 equity withdrawal initiated yesterday." I took a slow breath, aligning my posture in the ergonomic chair. The time for diversionary tactics was over. The decoy had served its purpose. "I authorize nothing," I replied, staring out at the Seattle skyline. "The signature on that home equity line of credit is a forgery." The line went entirely silent. Financial institutions train their representatives to handle distressed, panicked customers, but they rarely encounter a calm, clinical denial. I could hear the faint, rhythmic tapping of a keyboard through the receiver as the representative rapidly accessed the scanned document repository on her end. "Ma'am," she said, her tone shifting slightly, replacing the sterile customer service cadence with something much more guarded and cautious. "Your husband's signature is verified on this document, alongside a certified state notary stamp. Are you stating this is a fraudulent draw?" "I am stating that my brother-in-law, Connor Wells, forged my signature," I answered, my voice dropping to a precise, steady register. "I am stating that my husband, David Wells, facilitated the crime by transporting the forged documents across county lines to bypass verification. And I am stating that my mother-in-law, Patricia Wells, directly profited from the stolen capital, using it to clear her personal debt liabilities." The representative paused again, clearly caught off guard by the specific, granular accusations leveled against multiple family members. Before she could recite the standard corporate liability disclaimer, I took control of the dialogue. "I am sending an email to your secure fraud intake server right now," I instructed. "It contains a comprehensive forensic digital dossier. You will find the exact routing numbers where the capital was dispersed. You will find the IP addresses originating from Connor's personal devices. You will find the expired credentials of the Tacoma notary they utilized. And you will find documented, irrefutable proof of my geographical whereabouts on the afternoon the paperwork was supposedly signed in Pierce County." I pressed the Enter key on my keyboard. A small notification chimed, confirming the encrypted PDF had successfully transmitted to the bank's server. I waited 5 seconds, allowing the attachment to hit her inbox. "Furthermore," I added, my voice hardening into cold steel, "I filed a formal police report for identity theft and wire fraud exactly 20 minutes ago. The official law enforcement case number is printed in bold on the first page of the dossier you just received." There is a distinct psychological shift that occurs when a corporate compliance employee realizes they are no longer dealing with a domestic marital dispute, but an active criminal investigation. The hesitation on the other end of the line evaporated instantly. The legal liability suddenly shifted from my shoulders directly onto the bank. By providing a sworn police case number, I triggered a mandatory internal compliance protocol. The institution could no longer claim ignorance. "Thank you, Miss Wells," the investigator said. Her tone was no longer guarded. It was severe and highly professional. "With a police report on file, we are legally mandated to freeze the account and initiate a federal review. We will contact the local authorities to coordinate our internal findings. You will receive a secure communication from our legal department within the hour." I ended the call and set the phone face down on the glass desk. The room was perfectly still. The match was struck and tossed into the dry kindling of their curated lives. I thought about David waking up in his tangled sheets, pouring his morning coffee, believing he had successfully navigated the storm with a $30 bouquet of lilies. I thought about Patricia scheduling her tennis matches, confident in her unassailable social standing and her zeroed-out credit balances. I thought about Connor drafting his fictional investor pitches, fueled by an arrogance paid for with my stolen equity. They had operated under the fundamental assumption that I would prioritize the preservation of my marriage over my own financial survival. They assumed I would absorb the damage to keep the peace, but a peace built on extortion is just a prolonged hostage situation. I had spent years analyzing vulnerabilities in complex systems, ensuring structural integrity for corporate clients. I was never going to allow a parasite to hollow out my own foundation. When you sever a major artery in a digital banking network, the resulting systemic failure does not take days to manifest. Algorithms do not debate morality. They do not care about country club reputations or the complexities of family loyalty. They execute their programming with ruthless mechanical efficiency. I sat back in my chair and watched the digital clock on my secondary monitor tick forward. The Federal Review Protocol was now active. The containment parameters were set. All I had to do now was wait for the dominoes to fall and listen to the silence shatter. The beauty of a banking algorithm resides in its profound inability to feel pity. A software program cannot be manipulated by a cheap bouquet of supermarket flowers. It does not care if you belong to a prestigious tennis club or if you wear designer trench coats to project an aura of unassailable wealth. Code operates in binary absolutes. It views the world solely through the lens of risk and mitigation. When a $250,000 fraud alert is suddenly authenticated by a sworn law enforcement case number, the mainframe does not ask for emotional context. It simply executes a predefined containment protocol. By 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the digital containment perimeter snapped shut. The cascading failure began with my husband. When David co-signed that fraudulent home equity line of credit, he unwittingly triggered a standard cross-collateralization clause buried deep within the lender's terms of service. Financial institutions actively protect themselves against default. If an account holder commits a felony involving one asset, the bank immediately secures any other liquid assets linked to that same individual's Social Security number. The automated security protocols identified his primary checking account, the account where his modest project manager salary was deposited, and threw a digital padlock over the entire ledger. His available balance was instantly reduced to zero. At exactly 1:15, my cell phone vibrated on the glass surface of my desk. A text message illuminated the lock screen. It was from David. My card just got declined for a $12 lunch at a food truck. Did you do something to the accounts? I sat back in my ergonomic chair and visualized the scene unfolding several miles away. David worked near a trendy corporate plaza where food trucks lined the rain-slicked sidewalks during the lunch rush. I pictured him standing under a dripping canvas awning, holding a cardboard tray of overpriced tacos surrounded by his coworkers. I imagined the polite, apologetic smile of the cashier handing his premium debit card back to him. I saw the confused flush creeping up David's neck as the chip reader beeped a harsh red denial. He was a man who obsessed over projecting stability and competence to his peers. Experiencing a public financial rejection over a $12 meal would have felt like a physical blow. He assumed it was a minor glitch, perhaps a temporary hold I had placed during our negotiated repayment discussions. He still believed he was navigating a manageable marital dispute. He had no idea he was already standing in the epicenter of a federal investigation. I did not reply to his message. I cleared the notification from my screen and took a slow sip of my water. The silence from my end would only amplify his confusion. The algorithmic contagion continued to spread, moving laterally through the financial network they had constructed. At 2 o'clock, the hammer dropped on Connor. Connor had funneled the stolen equity into a shell limited liability company registered in Delaware. He assumed that inserting a corporate entity between himself and the forgery would act as a sufficient buffer. He lacked a fundamental understanding of modern anti-money laundering regulations. When the bank verified the fraudulent origin of the initial wire transfer, their compliance software automatically traced the routing path to the destination account. I monitored the status of the investigation through a secure client portal connected to the fraud department. A new update logged at exactly 2 p.m. indicated the Shell LLC accounts were now officially frozen, pending a comprehensive review by federal authorities. Connor was renting an expensive neon-lit loft in Pioneer Square for his highly publicized application launch party that very evening. He was attempting to secure a new wave of investors using the illusion of momentum. An event of that caliber requires constant, immediate capital. Caterers demand final payment upon arrival. Audiovisual technicians require cleared retainers before setting up their equipment. I knew Connor was currently standing in a drafty brick venue, frantically swiping his corporate card to cover the logistical overhead of his own vanity project. I pictured him staring at a tablet screen, reading an error code that refused to process his transactions. The smug, arrogant confidence he displayed at the coffee shop would be rapidly evaporating, replaced by a cold, suffocating terror. The offshore developers he claimed to have hired, the grand ventures he boasted about, they were all dissolving into digital vapor. He was entirely cut off from his stolen reservoir. But the most satisfying detonation was reserved for the architect of the family entitlement. At 3:30 in the afternoon, the machinery reached Patricia. My desk phone rang, disrupting the quiet hum of my office. It was not the sterile tone of a compliance officer this time. It was a direct call from a Bellevue area code. I answered the line, letting the silence stretch. "Megan." Patricia's voice tore through the receiver. She was breathless, frantic, stripped of her curated velvet tone. "What have you done?" Her panic was a visceral, living thing, transmitting through the fiber optic cables. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass desk. "I am having a productive Friday, Patricia," I answered, my cadence slow and deliberate. "How is your afternoon proceeding?" "My platinum card was just declined at Nordstrom," she gasped, her words stumbling over one another. I called the concierge line to yell at them for the embarrassment. They transferred me to a security director. They told me my entire credit profile has been locked due to suspicious funds origin. They said there is a flag on my account tied to a fraudulent corporate entity. She was hyperventilating, attempting to draw oxygen into lungs constrained by sudden, profound consequence. When she attached her name to Connor's shell company as a shadow partner, she tethered her own pristine credit rating to his criminal enterprise. She had used stolen capital to pay off her personal balances. The banking algorithms do not differentiate between a mastermind and a beneficiary. To the compliance software, Patricia Wells was merely another node in a money laundering network. "You froze the accounts," she accused, her voice cracking into a high-pitched shriek. "You vindictive, hysterical woman. You are destroying us." "I did not freeze your accounts, Patricia," I corrected her, slicing through her hysteria with surgical precision. "The Federal Bureau of Investigation freezes accounts when they are alerted to felony wire fraud. I simply provided them with the unredacted corporate registry proving you are actively profiting from a stolen home equity line." A sharp intake of breath echoed through the receiver, followed by a prolonged, stunned silence. The reality of her vulnerability finally pierced her armor. She had spent decades building an untouchable social fortress, utilizing her sons as shields and my income as mortar. Now the fortress was crumbling around her, and she lacked the structural integrity to hold it together. "You cannot do this," she whispered, the threat gone, replaced by a desperate, pleading tremor. "David will leave you. You will have nothing." "David has precisely $12 to his name and zero access to my salary," I replied. "I highly doubt he possesses the logistical resources to leave anyone today." I disconnected the call before she could formulate another desperate rationalization. I looked at the digital clock on my monitor. The entire Wells family financial apparatus, built on a fragile foundation of my money and Connor's lies, had ground to an absolute halt in under 3 hours. The speed of the collapse was breathtaking. They were locked out of their checking accounts, barred from their credit lines, and severed from the stolen equity. They were isolated, panicked, and functionally broke. For years, they had operated under the assumption that consequences were things that happened to other people. They believed their shared family name granted them immunity from the arithmetic of reality. I had just introduced them to the cold, unforgiving logic of consequence. The workday ended. Outside my window, the Seattle skyline flickered to life, casting bright reflections across the rain-soaked pavement. The storm was continuing to pour down upon the city. I logged off my terminal, gathered my coat, and walked out of the corporate tower. Connor was hosting his fraudulent launch party in a few hours. He had a room full of potential targets arriving expecting to be dazzled by a visionary entrepreneur. He was going to stand on a stage and attempt to pitch a ghost application to a crowd of wealthy investors while secretly drowning in an active federal investigation. His mother would be there, trying to maintain her social mask while her credit profile burned. My husband would be there, desperately pretending he had not mortgaged his own life to facilitate the disaster. They expected me to stay home and absorb the betrayal in silence. They expected the rigid, analytical wife to shy away from a public confrontation. I had spent the last 3 days playing the role of the defeated spouse, allowing them to believe they had won. Now it was time to step out of the shadows and attend a celebration. I walked toward my car, knowing exactly what I was going to wear to a financial funeral. Pioneer Square at night is a neighborhood defined by sharp contradictions. Historic red brick facades stand shoulder to shoulder with sleek modern startup incubators. I parked my vehicle on a slick cobblestone street, taking a moment to appreciate the biting chill in the October air before walking toward the venue. Connor had rented an expansive exposed brick loft for his highly anticipated application premiere. The entrance was flanked by velvet ropes and a hired security contractor checking names on an illuminated digital tablet. I did not possess an invitation, but I did not require one. I simply glided past the queue, projecting the undeniable authority of a woman who owned the establishment. The guard stepped aside without uttering a single syllable. Inside the loft, a heavy synthetic bass thudded through the wooden floorboards, driven by a hired DJ spinning curated electronic tracks. Neon lights in cool cerulean and vibrant magenta washed over the shifting crowd. The room was packed with the exact demographic Connor targeted. Affluent venture capitalists seeking the next unicorn investment, software engineers wearing designer sneakers, and social climbers holding expensive craft cocktails. It was an ecosystem of fabricated success built entirely on fragile perception. I unbuttoned my tailored trench coat but kept it draped over my shoulders, functioning as my armor. I stood near the back wall, blending into the shadows, observing the social machinery operate. Connor stood near a raised platform, holding court with 3 older men wearing bespoke charcoal suits. These were his marks, the angel investors he desperately needed to secure a real financial lifeline before his stolen bridge loan evaporated. He gestured expansively, flashing a charismatic pearly smile, playing the role of the visionary tech founder. It was a fascinating study in dramatic irony. I stood there, knowing the precise terminal state of his financial existence, while he performed his confident fiction. He believed he was moments away from securing millions in capital. I knew his entire corporate infrastructure had been legally paralyzed hours ago. Patricia was circulating near the catered sushi buffet. She wore a stunning emerald green cocktail dress, holding a crystal flute of sparkling wine. To the untrained observer, she looked like the proud, elegant matriarch celebrating her son's entrepreneurial triumph. But I knew her tells. Her smile was tight, brittle around the edges. Her eyes darted constantly toward the cell phone clutched tightly in her left hand. She had spent the afternoon hyperventilating over her frozen platinum accounts, and now she was desperately trying to maintain her aristocratic facade. She was trapped in her own performance, terrified that a single slipped word would reveal her ruined credit profile to her wealthy peers. David was hovering near the main bar. He looked utterly miserable. He wore a sharp navy blazer, but his posture betrayed his deep internal rot. He kept refreshing a banking application on his phone, staring at the screen as if sheer willpower could conjure a positive balance. He had tried to buy lunch from a food truck and suffered the humiliation of a declined transaction. Now he was surrounded by immense perceived wealth, possessing exactly zero purchasing power. He took a sip of a cheap domestic beer, looking like a man standing on a trap door, waiting for the executioner to pull the lever. The catalyst for the climax began when Connor decided to seal his pitch. I watched him guide the 3 potential investors toward the long zinc counter. The bartender, a young man wearing a crisp white shirt and a black vest, wiped down the metal surface. Connor leaned against the rail, projecting effortless prosperity. "We are drinking the vintage today," he announced, elevating his pitch to ensure the surrounding guests heard his order. "Bring us a reserve Dom Perignon, 4 glasses." The bartender nodded, retrieving the premium bottle from a locked, illuminated display case. The price tag for that specific vintage hovered right around $2,000. Connor pulled a sleek, heavy corporate credit card from his leather wallet and tossed it casually onto the rubber bar mat. The physical manifestation of his Delaware shell company. The card tied directly to the account I had frozen at 2 o'clock that afternoon. I stepped away from the wall, moving closer to the center of the room, tracking the interaction with a predator's focus. The bartender picked up the black card and inserted it into the digital payment terminal. The machine processed the request for 3 seconds. A sharp, negative beep cut through the immediate vicinity. The bartender frowned, pulling the plastic out and wiping the chip on his apron. "Just a read error, sir," he muttered, inserting it a second time. Connor chuckled, offering an easy, apologetic smile to the older investors. "New security chip," he lied smoothly. "Sometimes the friction makes it stick." The terminal processed again. The same sharp, negative beep echoed over the ambient noise. The bartender looked at the screen, then looked up at Connor. His professional courtesy remained intact, but his tone carried the distinct flat delivery of a service worker delivering bad news. "Declined, sir. Do you have an alternate form of payment?" The color drained from Connor's face in a rapid, horrifying cascade. The confident flush of the visionary founder vanished, replaced by a sickly pale gray. The 3 investors shifted uncomfortably, exchanging subtle, knowing glances. In their cutthroat world, a declined transaction at a public networking event was the ultimate red flag, indicating deep insolvency. Connor patted his blazer pockets, his hands trembling slightly, searching for a personal card he knew was also rendered useless by the cross-collateralization freeze. Patricia witnessed the interaction from across the loft. Her maternal radar detected the sudden, catastrophic shift in social gravity. She abandoned her conversation and marched toward the bar, her emerald dress swishing sharply with each frantic step. As she crossed the floor, her eyes locked onto me. I had positioned myself directly in her path. The brittle smile she had worn all evening shattered. Her eyes blazed with a frantic, cornered fury. She stopped 3 feet away, pointing a manicured finger at my chest. "You," she hissed, her voice, a serrated whisper designed to cut without drawing a crowd. "You froze the accounts. You ruined his night. You are sabotaging this entire family." Connor heard her voice and whipped his head around. He saw me standing there, calm, unbothered, bathed in the neon lights. The sheer humiliation of the declined card ignited his temper. He abandoned the investors and stormed over, flanking his mother. Several curious guests stepped back, forming a loose circle around our confrontation. The tension in the loft spiked, drawing the attention of the surrounding crowd. "What are you doing here?" Connor demanded, his voice rising above the electronic music. "This is a private corporate event. You have no right to be in this building. I am calling the police, Megan. I am having you arrested for trespassing." He reached for his phone, brandishing it like a weapon. He thought volume would intimidate me. He assumed a public threat would force me to retreat into the shadows and preserve the fragile peace. I did not shrink. I did not lower my gaze. I stepped forward, closing the physical distance between us. I inhaled, drawing the ambient air of the loft into my lungs, and projected my voice. I did not scream, but I spoke with a resonant, ringing clarity that sliced through the heavy bass in the murmuring crowd. I ensured every single investor, socialite, and tech founder in that circle heard every syllable. "You do not need to call the police, Connor," I stated, my words landing like heavy stones on a glass table. "The bank already called the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Connor froze, his thumb hovering over his phone screen. Patricia's jaw dropped open, a silent gasp trapped in her throat. "You forged my signature on a legal deed," I continued, the volume of my voice commanding the immediate space. "You committed wire fraud to steal $250,000 from my home equity, and you funneled that stolen capital directly into your mother's shadow corporation to pay off her personal credit card debt." The DJ, sensing the sudden hostile shift in the room's energy, abruptly cut the music. The heavy electronic bass died, leaving a ringing, echoing silence in its wake. My final words hung in the air, naked and undeniable. "The audit trail is currently sitting on the desk of a federal fraud investigator." In the deafening quiet that followed, a sharp, shattering sound echoed from the far side of the bar. Everyone turned their heads. David was standing near a high-top table, his face ashen, his eyes wide with unadulterated terror. He had dropped his pint glass. The thick glass shards lay scattered across the polished concrete floor, a pool of cheap beer spreading outward. The illusion was dead. The curtain had fallen, and my husband was left standing in the wreckage, realizing that his appeasement had just cost him his entire existence. The sound of the shattered glass reverberated through the sudden, suffocating quiet of the loft. The sharp crash acted as a final punctuation mark on the illusion Connor had so carefully constructed. Beside the raised platform, the three bespoke-suited angel investors exchanged a single, synchronized glance of profound alarm. In the high-stakes ecosystem of venture capital, perception dictates reality. They had just watched a founder's corporate card fail, followed instantly by allegations of federal wire fraud delivered with clinical certainty. They did not pause to ask questions. They pivoted in unison and walked briskly toward the exit. Capital flees from instability, and Connor was now a terminal risk. Connor stood frozen on his stage. His mouth opened and closed in a silent, erratic rhythm, resembling a suffocating fish pulled from deep water. The sleek, black corporate card remained abandoned on the wet rubber bar mat, a useless rectangle of plastic. Across the room, Patricia remained anchored to the floorboards. The vibrant emerald cocktail dress draped over her frame now looked less like aristocratic attire and more like a cheap theatrical costume she could no longer finance. David navigated the spreading pool of spilled beer and broken glass. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin stretched tight and pallid over his cheekbones. He moved toward me with a frantic, desperate, kinetic energy. His hands reached out, palms facing upward, as if he could physically catch the devastating words and shove them back into my throat. "Meg, please," he begged. His voice cracked, emerging as a high, thin sound stripped of all its usual suburban polish and rehearsed calm. "Please stop. Do not do this here. Let us go home and talk." He reached for my forearm, seeking the familiar tactile reassurance he had relied upon for 5 years. I did not step backward. I did not flinch. I simply shifted my weight and delivered a gaze so sharp, so devoid of residual affection, that his hands faltered in midair. He dropped his arms to his sides, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "I co-signed that loan," he stammered, the crushing weight of the federal investigation finally breaching his dense wall of denial. If he goes down for wire fraud, I go down for conspiracy. They will take the house, Meg. We will lose the house. You have to call the bank back right now. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we authorized the transaction together. I studied this man. I looked at the person with whom I had planned a hypothetical nursery. The partner who had quietly funneled our shared future to a blackmailer to cover up a crime. Even now, standing in the wreckage of his own making, he was still attempting to use plural pronouns. We will lose the house. We authorized it. He still believed we were a unified entity. He still thought he could hide behind my credibility. I let the heavy silence stretch. I allowed the remaining crowd of socialites and tech founders to lean in, capturing every microscopic nuance of his public humiliation. I will not lose the house, David, I said. My voice was a soft, steady metronome, yet it carried across the exposed brick walls with piercing, undeniable clarity. Here is the gasp-worthy reality of Washington state community property and real estate law when verified fraud is introduced into the equation. The moment the banking institution and the federal authorities confirm my signature was forged, the lien becomes legally invalid against my 50% equity. A fraudulent document cannot encumber an innocent party. I watched his pupils dilate as the arithmetic settled into his panicked brain. The trap was springing shut, locking him inside. But your authentic signature, I continued, stepping one fraction of an inch closer, lowering my pitch to a lethal, unyielding whisper. Your verified, legally binding signature resting right next to my forged one that makes you solely financially responsible for the entire $250,000 debt. The bank will not seize my half of the property. They will seize yours. David stopped breathing. The ambient magenta and cerulean neon lights reflected off the cold sweat gathering along his hairline. You stole from our unborn children to protect a practicing criminal, I stated, delivering the final terminal audit of our marriage. You drained the high-yield savings account. You wired $50,000 to silence an angry investor. I traced the routing numbers, David. I saw the legal settlement memo. I unlocked the Delaware corporate registry and found your mother listed as a shadow partner. I know every single hidden variable. Patricia let out a strangled, hollow noise, leaning heavily against a high-top wooden table for physical support. Connor stared at his older brother, the horrifying realization dawning on him that his disposable transport vehicle had just been crushed into dust. There was no one left to absorb the shockwaves. The impact was going to hit them directly. I filed the formal divorce petition at 4 o'clock this afternoon, I informed him, maintaining an unbroken, icy gaze. My remaining assets are legally secured inside a private trust beyond your reach. You are going to sell that mid-century split level to pay back the federal government. You can pack your golf clubs and move back into your mother's condo in Bellevue, assuming she does not lose the property when her shell corporation is federally indicted. Connor would inevitably face a federal penitentiary sentence for identity theft and wire fraud. That was a standard judicial outcome. But David's poetic justice was far more enduring. He was facing a lifetime of severe, inescapable financial ruin, chained to the exact brother he had sacrificed his marriage to protect. I raised my left hand. The overhead lighting caught the precise facets of the diamond resting on my ring finger. It was a beautiful, mathematically perfect stone. It represented a contract he had fundamentally breached. I slid the cold platinum band over my knuckle. It slipped off with effortless ease, leaving a faint, pale indentation on my skin. I turned toward the high-top table beside me. A neat stack of Connor's glossy fictional promotional flyers rested on the dark wood surface, advertising a decentralized logistics application that would never exist. I placed the wedding ring right in the center of the printed propaganda. The heavy metal settled onto the paper with a quiet, defining click. I did not wait for the tears to fall from his eyes. I did not linger to watch the federal agents arrive, though I knew the approaching sirens were an inevitable conclusion to this curated evening. I buttoned the top button of my tailored trench coat, shielding myself from the toxic environment. I turned my back on the three of them. The surrounding crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path leading straight to the heavy brass doors. They stepped aside with an almost reverent caution, unwilling to interfere with the momentum of a woman who had just executed a flawless demolition. I walked out of the loft, my heels clicking a steady, even tempo on the polished concrete floor. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the stagnant, perfumed air of the venue. I stepped out onto the slick, uneven cobblestones of Pioneer Square. The Seattle rain was still falling in a steady, cleansing downpour, washing the city streets clean. The air was cold, sharp, and deeply invigorating. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the damp, pine-scented wind blowing in from the dark waters of the Puget Sound. I had amputated the necrotic tissue. The corrupted nodes were isolated, and the system was fully purged. I walked toward my car, leaving them to drown in the exact structural collapse they had built. The sound of the shattered glass reverberated through the sudden, suffocating quiet of the loft. The sharp crash acted as a final punctuation mark on the illusion Connor had so carefully constructed. Beside the raised platform, the three bespoke-suited angel investors exchanged a single, synchronized glance of profound alarm. In the high-stakes ecosystem of venture capital, perception dictates reality. They had just watched a founder's corporate card fail, followed instantly by allegations of federal wire fraud delivered with clinical certainty. They did not pause to ask questions. They pivoted in unison and walked briskly toward the exit. Capital flees from instability, and Connor was now a terminal risk. Connor stood frozen on his stage. His mouth opened and closed in a silent, erratic rhythm resembling a suffocating fish pulled from deep water. The sleek black corporate card remained abandoned on the wet rubber bar mat, a useless rectangle of plastic. Across the room, Patricia remained anchored to the floorboards. The vibrant emerald cocktail dress draped over her frame now looked less like aristocratic attire and more like a cheap theatrical costume she could no longer finance. David navigated the spreading pool of spilled beer and broken glass. The color had drained from his face, leaving his skin stretched tight and pallid over his cheekbones. He moved toward me with a frantic, desperate, kinetic energy. His hands reached out, palms facing upward, as if he could physically catch the devastating words and shove them back into my throat. "Meg, please," he begged. His voice cracked, emerging as a high, thin sound stripped of all its usual suburban polish and rehearsed calm. "Please, stop. Do not do this here. Let us go home and talk." He reached for my forearm, seeking the familiar tactile reassurance he had relied upon for 5 years. I did not step backward. I did not flinch. I simply shifted my weight and delivered a gaze so sharp, so devoid of residual affection that his hands faltered in midair. He dropped his arms to his sides, his breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. "I co-signed that loan," he stammered, the crushing weight of the federal investigation finally breaching his dense wall of denial. "If he goes down for wire fraud, I go down for conspiracy. They will take the house, Meg. We will lose the house. You have to call the bank back right now. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we authorized the transaction together." I studied this man. I looked at the person with whom I had planned a hypothetical nursery. the partner who had quietly funneled our shared future to a blackmailer to cover up a crime. Even now, standing in the wreckage of his own making, he was still attempting to use plural pronouns. We will lose the house. We authorized it. He still believed we were a unified entity. He still thought he could hide behind my credibility. I let the heavy silence stretch. I allowed the remaining crowd of socialites and tech founders to lean in, capturing every microscopic nuance of his public humiliation. "I will not lose the house, David," I said. My voice was a soft, steady metronome, yet it carried across the exposed brick walls with piercing, undeniable clarity. Here is the gasp-worthy reality of Washington state community property and real estate law when verified fraud is introduced into the equation. The moment the banking institution and the federal authorities confirm my signature was forged, the lien becomes legally invalid against my 50% equity. A fraudulent document cannot encumber an innocent party. I watched his pupils dilate as the arithmetic settled into his panicked brain. The trap was springing shut, locking him inside. "But your authentic signature," I continued, stepping one fraction of an inch closer, lowering my pitch to a lethal, unyielding whisper. "Your verified, legally binding signature resting right next to my forged one that makes you solely financially responsible for the entire $250,000 debt. The bank will not seize my half of the property. They will seize yours." David stopped breathing. The ambient magenta and cerulean neon lights reflected off the cold sweat gathering along his hairline. "You stole from our unborn children to protect a practicing criminal," I stated, delivering the final terminal audit of our marriage. "You drained the high-yield savings account. You wired $50,000 to silence an angry investor." I traced the routing numbers, David. I saw the legal settlement memo. I unlocked the Delaware corporate registry and found your mother listed as a shadow partner. I know every single hidden variable. Patricia let out a strangled, hollow noise, leaning heavily against a high-top wooden table for physical support. Connor stared at his older brother, the horrifying realization dawning on him that his disposable transport vehicle had just been crushed into dust. There was no one left to absorb the shockwaves. The impact was going to hit them directly. "I filed the formal divorce petition at 4 o'clock this afternoon," I informed him, maintaining an unbroken, icy gaze. "My remaining assets are legally secured inside a private trust beyond your reach. You are going to sell that mid-century split level to pay back the federal government. You can pack your golf clubs and move back into your mother's condo in Bellevue, assuming she does not lose the property when her shell corporation is federally indicted." Connor would inevitably face a federal penitentiary sentence for identity theft and wire fraud. That was a standard judicial outcome. But David's poetic justice was far more enduring. He was facing a lifetime of severe, inescapable financial ruin chained to the exact brother he had sacrificed his marriage to protect. I raised my left hand. The overhead lighting caught the precise facets of the diamond resting on my ring finger. It was a beautiful, mathematically perfect stone. It represented a contract he had fundamentally breached. I slid the cold platinum band over my knuckle. It slipped off with effortless ease, leaving a faint, pale indentation on my skin. I turned toward the high-top table beside me. A neat stack of Connor's glossy, fictional promotional flyers rested on the dark wood surface, advertising a decentralized logistics application that would never exist. I placed the wedding ring right in the center of the printed propaganda. The heavy metal settled onto the paper with a quiet, defining click. I did not wait for the tears to fall from his eyes. I did not linger to watch the federal agents arrive, though I knew the approaching sirens were an inevitable conclusion to this curated evening. I buttoned the top button of my tailored trench coat, shielding myself from the toxic environment. I turned my back on the three of them. The surrounding crowd parted instantly, creating a wide, clear path leading straight to the heavy brass doors. They stepped aside with an almost reverent caution, unwilling to interfere with the momentum of a woman who had just executed a flawless demolition. I walked out of the loft, my heels clicking a steady, even tempo on the polished concrete floor. The heavy brass doors swung shut behind me, cutting off the stagnant, perfumed air of the venue. I stepped out onto the slick, uneven cobblestones of Pioneer Square. The Seattle rain was still falling in a steady, cleansing downpour, washing the city streets clean. The air was cold, sharp, and deeply invigorating. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with the damp, pine-scented wind blowing in from the dark waters of the Puget Sound. I had amputated the necrotic tissue. The corrupted nodes were isolated and the system was fully purged. I walked toward my car, leaving them to drown in the exact structural collapse they had built.